In the Middle Ages, slaves bore the burden of labor in fields, castles, and construction sites. Their daily lives were not only physically demanding but also mentally exhausting. But how did a slave, toiling in the fields or treated as the property of a noble, spend a single day? As we progress through this video, we will explore 24 hours in the life of a medieval slave, how they survived, and the struggles they endured in their quest for freedom. But before that, let's take a look at the history of slavery and what it actually was. Slavery is an institution as old as human history itself, first emerging with the development of agriculture. As human societies transitioned to a sedentary lifestyle during the agricultural revolution, the practice of forcing war captives and debtors into labor became widespread. The earliest known slavery systems appeared in the civilizations of the Sumerians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Chinese, and Indians. In ancient Greece and Rome, slavery was the backbone of economic and social order. Slaves were used for agricultural labor, household chores, and even state functions. Although slavery declined in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, it persisted throughout the Middle Ages. The Vikings, Arab traders, and Byzantines played significant roles in the slave trade. During the Middle Ages, slavery continued in various forms across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. By the 15th century, with the rise of European colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade began, forcibly transporting millions of people from Africa to the Americas. In the modern era, slavery was gradually abolished due to the Industrial Revolution and human rights movements, with most countries outlawing it by the 19th century. Medieval slavery, much like that of ancient Rome, was a fundamental part of the social structure. Slaves occupied the lowest tier of society and were often bound to the lands of feudal lords and church institutions. They were among the most valuable assets of landowners, as no agricultural production could take place without their labor. In addition to working in fields, slaves carried out construction labor, served as soldiers in wars, and sometimes performed household tasks. A slave's status varied depending on their master and the region in which they lived. Slaves had no personal rights. Their freedom was entirely dependent on their environment and their owners. They had no legal status of their own. Their existence and fate were at the mercy of their masters. In the Middle Ages, slaves were often war captives or individuals who had fallen into debt they could not repay. Slavery played a crucial role in the feudal system, as the medieval European economy was largely based on agriculture. Landowners accumulated wealth through the labor of slaves, while for many slaves, working for their masters was their only means of survival. The church also played a significant role in maintaining slavery, as many church-owned lands were worked by slaves. This form of servitude was often justified through religious arguments, framing it as a path to spiritual salvation. The social status of slaves in the Middle Ages was utterly degrading. They were not even considered part of the lowest social class. They had no recognized place in society at all. Many slaves felt like mere possessions, as their masters could use, sell, or, in the worst cases, kill them at will. The places where they lived were akin to storage spaces for goods, focusing solely on their labor output. Every basic human right was denied to them. Their clothing, treatment, and even their bodies were entirely under their owner's control. In their workplaces, food, clothing, and living conditions were kept at a minimum. Many slaves received just enough food to survive, leaving them entirely dependent on the mercy of their masters. Their social standing was so low that they had almost no contact with other social classes. Their interactions were limited to their work environment and the solidarity they found among fellow slaves. However, some slaves in the Middle Ages worked under relatively less oppressive conditions, provided their masters allowed it. For example, skilled slaves were sometimes sent to work as artisans in small towns or cities. These slaves generally faced less harsh treatment compared to those working on vast estates or in battlefields. Nevertheless, where a slave worked was entirely determined by their owner's needs and economic considerations. They had no freedom to choose their place of labor. Medieval slaves worked relentlessly throughout the day. Their working hours typically began at sunrise and lasted until nightfall, sometimes even into the late hours. Such long hours took a severe toll on their bodies, leaving little room for rest. Their workplaces were often harsh and hazardous. Agricultural labor meant constant exposure to soil and extreme weather conditions. On rainy days, they had to toil through puddles of water, and in the scorching summer heat, they endured grueling hours under the sun. The areas where slaves worked were quite varied. Some slaves worked on large construction projects, while others served in the homes of nobles. Some slaves were assigned to special tasks, such as working the land or capturing prisoners during wars. Depending on the type of work they did, the challenges faced by slaves varied. Slaves working in construction often reached a point of physical exhaustion while working in quarries or building large structures. These types of jobs placed a heavy burden on the bodies of slaves. Another area where slaves worked was in mines. Slaves working under harsh conditions in the mines dug for hours in narrow, airless, and dark tunnels. Collapses, poisonous gases, and constant physical fatigue threatened their lives. They had no chance of escape, and most died young due to illness or accidents. A slave's daily life was essentially spent between work and rest. This cycle constantly repeated, a life devoid of freedom. The sunrise marked the beginning of a slave's day. Early in the morning, they would begin working according to their master's instructions. Many slaves, after getting up from their simple beds, couldn't have a large breakfast early in the morning. Their breakfast usually consisted of bread, cheese, and if they were lucky that day, a small piece of meat. Before starting work, this meal would keep them somewhat energized, but it was definitely not enough. In the Middle Ages, some slaves worked in homes, castles, or estates. These slaves' tasks were primarily centered around serving. Cooking, cleaning, and attending to their master's daily needs were the types of duties assigned to these slaves. Although slaves working in domestic service were physically less worn out than those working in the fields, they experienced great stress from being constantly under observation. From time to time, solidarity arose among slaves. Many slaves tried to support each other by working together. However, this solidarity mostly occurred in safe areas or outside working hours. During work hours, slaves were forbidden from distracting each other, which further exacerbated their difficult situations. A slave's daily life was not only physically, but also mentally torturous. Many slaves were at the mercy of their masters to live an honorable life. The social relationships of slaves were mostly limited to one another. It was nearly impossible for them to communicate with others, especially the upper classes. If a slave tried to communicate with their master or someone from the upper classes, they could be punished. Therefore, the lives of slaves were usually shaped by solitude and solidarity with others of their kind. Most of the time, slaves working in the fields or in service areas did not speak to each other. They were prohibited from communicating in any way until their work was finished. When slaves found opportunities to help and come together, they formed strong social bonds. These bonds helped them survive. Occasionally, slaves would help each other with extraordinary tasks. One slave might assist another in finishing their work, and in return, the other slave could do a favor. However, such help was usually limited to small tasks, and creating a large-scale solidarity was difficult. The social structure of slaves was generally restricted, but outside these limitations, their ways of helping each other sometimes brought different groups together. In a slave's world, family members often held great importance. Many slaves would take great risks to keep their families together. However, this situation added another layer of difficulty to their daily lives, because when masters noticed these family bonds, they would do everything in their power to sever them as a form of punishment. Throughout the Middle Ages, slaves were often subjected to tremendous pressure and exploitation. However, from time to time, slaves also showed various forms of resistance to escape this fate. These resistances were usually small-scale and often ended in failure. However, these resistances symbolized the slave's struggle for freedom. Slave uprisings typically took the form of rebellions or escapes on large estates and in the mansions of the nobility. However, most of these resistances faced great challenges in organizing and developing effective strategies. Additionally, slaves not only stood in solidarity with other slaves, but also with other lower classes, such as serfs. However, these movements were often brutally suppressed, and the slaves involved faced severe punishments. Since slave uprisings rarely occurred on a national scale, they were mostly local and small in scope. Nevertheless, these uprisings still revealed the slaves' desire for freedom. The resistance in the lives of slaves was not only a physical fight, but also a spiritual search for freedom. For many slaves, their daily lives were often focused on mere survival, but they carried within them a deep yearning for freedom. What about you? What do you think about the historical impact of the system of slavery and the marks it has left in the present day? Do you think humanity has learned enough from this dark past? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.